He raised a kettle toward his own daughter, and in less than 2 seconds, her mother moved. She didn't think. She didn't hesitate. The water hit her arm instead. But what she did next destroyed him completely. Renee was standing in her kitchen that Thursday evening when everything changed. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because what happened in that kitchen didn't start that night. It started months earlier. Renee had been preparing, quietly, carefully, for 6 months. She had been building something, and on that Thursday evening, it was tested, and it held. But what she did next, most people would never think of doing. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from. And if you're not subscribed to Behind the Lie, subscribe now, because this story gets worse. Renee had grown up in Memphis, Tennessee, the middle of 3 children in a household that her friends described consistently as the kind of household they had always wished they had grown up in. Her parents had been married for 35 years at the time this story begins, which is not a guarantee of anything in particular about the quality of a marriage, but which in the case of Renee's parents was evidence of something genuine, two people who had built a life together with the kind of mutual respect and consistent presence that made their household feel, to everyone who entered it, like a place where people were actually seen. Her father had worked as an electrician for 28 years. Her mother had been an elementary school teacher for 22. They had built a modest and completely solid life in the particular way of people who understand that solid and modest is a better foundation than spectacular and unstable, and they had transmitted that understanding to their children through the simple, sustained evidence of their own daily choices. Renee had studied nursing at a state university in Tennessee, worked for 4 years in the pediatric unit of a Memphis hospital, and had moved to Atlanta when she was 29 after marrying Marcus, a man she had met at a mutual friend's wedding and had dated for 2 years before agreeing to marry him with the careful deliberateness of a woman who understood what she was committing to and had taken the time to be sure. She had transferred her nursing license to Georgia and had worked part-time at a pediatric clinic in Atlanta from a year after Amara was born, balancing the work with the primary care of her daughter in the particular organized way of a woman who was good at managing multiple demands simultaneously and who had never needed anyone to tell her how to do it. Amara was 7 years old when this story reached its turning point. She had her mother's eyes and her father's laugh and a specific and completely individual personality that had been apparent since she was approximately 14 months old, and had first demonstrated the combination of stubbornness and warmth that her preschool teacher had described in a parent conference when Amara was 4 as the most charming and exhausting combination she had encountered in 20 years of teaching. Amara liked soccer and drawing and a specific series of chapter books about a girl detective that she had been working through for the previous year and that she carried everywhere in a backpack that also contained a stuffed rabbit named Gerald who had been with her since she was 18 months old. She was, in every ordinary way, a child who was loved and who knew it, and who had organized her understanding of the world around the reliable presence of 2 parents who showed up for her. She did not yet know that one of those parents was in the process of becoming someone she needed to be protected from. Children rarely know that until the moment the protection becomes necessary. For Amara, that moment arrived on a Thursday evening in the kitchen of the only home she had ever known. She was 7 years old. Gerald was in her backpack on the kitchen chair beside her, and her mother crossed the kitchen in less than 2 seconds and changed everything. Marcus was 41 years old and had been, for the first 6 years of his marriage to Renee, genuinely present in the ways that matter most in a family. He had coached Amara's soccer team for 2 seasons, which required showing up on Saturday mornings when showing up was inconvenient and staying even when the games ran long. He had established himself as the parent Amara called for when she woke from nightmares, Not because Renee was less available, but because he had made himself consistently available in that specific way, and Amara had learned she could count on it. He had been, in the particular texture of daily family life, a father whose presence was real and whose investment was not performed. Something had changed 18 months before the Thursday evening in the kitchen, and the change had begun, as these changes tend to begin, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of small choices that each seemed manageable in isolation and that accumulated into something that was not manageable and not small. He had met a woman named Celeste at an industry conference in Charlotte. Celeste was 31 years old, and she had, from the beginning of their acquaintance, presented herself to Marcus in the specific way of a person who understands that what they are offering is not a relationship, but an alternative version of a man's life. A version in which his existing obligations do not appear and his existing compromises are replaced by a feeling of possibility that is real in the way that feelings are real and false in the way that feelings built on incomplete information are always false. Marcus had been susceptible to this in the way that people are susceptible to things that address an unexamined discontent. He had made the first choice, then the second, and then he had been making choices for 18 months that were dismantling, one by one, the things that had made him the person Renee had agreed to marry. Renee had noticed the change at approximately the 6-month mark, not through any single dramatic discovery, but through the accumulated evidence of small, specific observations that a woman who had spent 9 years paying close attention to a person she loved was equipped to make. The quality of his presence had changed. He was physically in the house, but the particular attentiveness that had always characterized his engagement with Renee and with Amara was diminishing in ways that were difficult to name individually, but that were collectively unmistakable to a woman who knew what his full attention felt like and could feel the difference when it was partially elsewhere. He was taking calls in rooms where she was not present. He was coming home at consistent times, but arriving with the particular distraction of someone whose mind had been occupied elsewhere and had not fully returned. Amara had noticed, too, in the way that 7-year-olds notice things they do not have language for, expressing the noticing through the specific request to be put to bed by her mother more frequently than she had previously requested, a small data point that Renee had filed alongside the others. She had found out about Celeste 6 months before the Thursday kitchen evening through a combination of her own observations and a specific piece of information that arrived through a mutual contact who had decided, after their own period of sitting with the knowledge, that Renee deserved to have it. Renee had received this information. She had sat in her car in the parking lot of the clinic where she worked for 35 minutes after the contact told her. She had not cried. She had thought. And when she had finished thinking, she had made a decision about what she was going to do, which was not the decision that the situation seemed to call for in the obvious sense. She was not going to confront Marcus. She was not going to make a scene. She was going to build. She was going to prepare. She was going to create the conditions that would allow her to protect herself and Amara when the moment came to act, so that when that moment arrived, she would be ready for it rather than surprised by it. She was almost ready when Thursday happened. Almost, but not quite. Thursday accelerated the timeline. The 6 months between finding out about Celeste and the Thursday kitchen evening had been the most quietly productive 6 months of Renee's life in ways that nobody in her household was aware of. She had consulted with a family law attorney, not to file anything, but to understand the legal landscape she was living in, specifically the Georgia laws governing divorce, custody, and child protection, and specifically the documentation that would be most useful to have in place before any formal proceedings began. She had been keeping a private record in a document stored on a cloud account that Marcus did not have access to of specific incidents and observations that her attorney had told her were the kinds of details that family courts find relevant when determining custody arrangements and the fitness of each parent for primary care of a minor child. She had documented the changes in Marcus's behavior with the precision of a nurse who had been trained to observe and record clinical data accurately and without editorializing. She had documented Amara's responses to those changes. She had documented the dates and durations of Marcus's unexplained absences from family activities that had previously been reliable. She had also, on her attorney's advice, begun quietly organizing her financial documentation in a way that established a clear and independent picture of her own financial contributions to the marriage and her own financial capacity as an independent person. She had opened a separate savings account. She had maintained her own credit history. She had done none of this loudly or dramatically because none of it needed to be loud or dramatic. It needed to be thorough. And Renee was thorough. The Thursday evening that produced the kitchen moment had begun as an ordinary Thursday in every visible way. Renee had picked Amara up from school. They had gone to the grocery store. Renee had started dinner. Amara was at the kitchen table with Gerald and a chapter from the current book in the detective series. Marcus had come home at the expected time, which was itself a small variation from the pattern of the previous several weeks. And Renee had noted it in the way she noted everything, without reaction and without comment. What was not ordinary about that Thursday was that Celeste arrived 40 minutes after Marcus. She had not been invited by Renee. She had been, by all subsequent evidence, invited by Marcus in a way that had not been discussed with or disclosed to his wife, which is a specific category of behavior that Renee's attorney later described in the legal proceedings as consistent with a pattern of conduct in which Marcus had been progressively treating the shared family home as an extension of his own private domain rather than as the home of a family that included a wife and a 7-year-old child. Renee opened the door when Celeste arrived. She looked at Celeste. She looked at Marcus. She made a decision at that moment about what the evening was going to require of her, which was the same decision she had been practicing for 6 months. She was going to remain composed. She was going to observe. She was going to document. And she was going to protect Amara from whatever the evening produced, which she did not yet know would include a kettle. Celeste was 31 years old and had been, for the 18 months of her relationship with Marcus, the organizing principle of the alternative version of his life that he had been constructing alongside the actual one. She had not been in the family home before that Thursday. She had been in every other part of Marcus's reconstructed life, but not in the house where his wife and daughter lived. And her presence there on that Thursday evening represented a crossing of a line that Marcus had apparently decided, without consulting anyone who might have given him a useful perspective on the decision, was acceptable. She had been in the house for approximately 20 minutes when she made the comment in the kitchen. The comment was about Amara. It was directed at Marcus. It was loud enough for Renee, who was in the adjacent room, to hear every word. The specific content of that comment has been documented in the subsequent legal proceedings and has been characterized by everyone involved in those proceedings, including the judge, as among the most disturbing things introduced in evidence in a family court matter in that jurisdiction in recent memory. The comment characterized Amara in terms that were false and cruel, and that ended with a direct instruction to Marcus to demonstrate, in immediate and physical terms that Celeste specified, that his commitment was to her rather than to the 7-year-old girl who was sitting at the kitchen table with her stuffed rabbit and her chapter book. Marcus had the kettle in his hand because he had been making tea. He tilted it. Renee was in the doorway. She covered the distance between the doorway and her daughter in less than 2 seconds. The water contacted her arm. Amara was not burned. Renee was. What happened in the 10 minutes after Renee absorbed what was meant for Amara has been described by Renee with the particular precision of a woman who has had a significant amount of time to examine those minutes from every angle and who has arrived at a place where she can describe them without the description being consumed by the enormity of what they contained. She picked Amara up. She held her. She looked at Marcus over Amara's shoulder with an expression that Marcus has since described, in the limited public statements he has made, as the expression that told him something had changed that was not going to change back. She said, in a voice that Amara would later describe to a therapist as the quietest voice she had ever heard her mother use, that Celeste needed to leave the house. Celeste left. Marcus stood in the kitchen and said nothing. Renee took Amara to the bathroom and ran cool water over the burn on her own arm, which was significant enough to require medical attention, but not severe enough to be permanently damaging. And then she sat on the bathroom floor with Amara in her lap and Amara's arms around her neck, and she stayed there for approximately 15 minutes while the situation in the kitchen resolved itself through Marcus's own choices, which included not following them to the bathroom and not saying anything through the closed door. Then Renee stood up. She carried Amara to Amara's room. She read her 2 chapters of the current detective book. She waited until Amara was asleep. Then she went to the kitchen, picked up her phone, and began making calls. The first call was to her mother in Memphis. She told her mother what had happened in 4 sentences, and her mother said she would be in the car in 20 minutes, which was the response of a woman who had raised 3 children to understand what a family does when one of its members needs it. The second call was to her family law attorney, whose after-hours line she called and left a message on that described the events of the evening in the clinical and precise language of a nurse who has been trained to document incidents accurately and who had been practicing that documentation for 6 months. The third call was to the Atlanta Police Department, not to 911, because the immediate danger had passed, but to the non-emergency line to report the incident and to create a documented record that a law enforcement agency had been informed of what had occurred in her home that evening. Her attorney had told her, in one of their consultations, that the existence of a contemporaneous report to law enforcement was among the most significant factors that family courts considered when evaluating the credibility of a parent's account of events that a court had not witnessed. Renee had remembered this. She made the call. She gave her account. She asked for a record number. She wrote it down. Then she went to her bedroom, past Marcus, who was in the living room and who watched her walk past without saying anything. And she opened her laptop and she added the evening's events to the private documentation record she had been maintaining for 6 months, with the record number from the police call included, and the time, and the specific sequence of events, and the name of the witness who had been present in the house when it occurred, which was Amara, age 7, and the nature of the burn on Renee's arm, which she photographed with her phone before treating it properly. She then sent an email to her attorney with the documentation attached. It was 11:47 in the evening. Her mother was 4 hours away. Marcus was in the living room. Amara was asleep, and Renee had done, in approximately 90 minutes, more to protect the future of herself and her daughter than most people manage to accomplish in a week. Her mother arrived at 3:45 in the morning. Renee had her bag packed. Amara's bag was packed. Gerald was in Amara's backpack. Marcus was asleep in the bedroom. Renee carried Amara to her mother's car without waking her. Amara woke up briefly when the car door closed, looked at her grandmother, said her grandmother's name with the sleepy satisfaction of a child who is in the presence of someone safe, and went back to sleep. Renee's mother drove. Renee sat in the passenger seat with her arm dressed and her phone in her hand, and her private documentation accessible on her cloud account, and the record number from the police call written in the notes application of her phone. She did not cry during the drive. She has said she did not cry until they were past the Georgia state line and Tennessee was on the horizon, and that when she did cry, it was not from grief or from fear, but from the particular release of a person who has been holding something very tightly for a very long time and has finally arrived in a place where they can let it go a little. Amara slept the whole way. Gerald was in her arms. The legal proceedings that followed the Thursday kitchen evening were handled with the thoroughness and the documentation that Renee had been preparing for 6 months. Her attorney filed for an emergency protective order on Friday morning, citing the incident of the previous evening with supporting documentation that included the police record number, the photographic evidence of Renee's burn, and the 6 months of documented observations that Renee had been maintaining. Emergency protective orders in Georgia require the petitioner to demonstrate to the court that there is a credible and immediate threat to the safety of the petitioner or a minor child. Renee's documentation provided exactly this. The order was granted the same day. It required Marcus to vacate the family home and to maintain a specified distance from Renee and Amara. Marcus was notified of the order by the Atlanta Police Department on Friday afternoon. He was in the house when the notification was delivered. He left the house. He was, as the title of this story specifies, the last thing he ever did in that house as a free man. He was not arrested on Friday. The arrest came later, in the second week of the legal proceedings, when the full scope of the evidence Renee had assembled was presented, and when Marcus's own statements in response to that evidence established a record that the district attorney's office found sufficient to proceed with charges related to the incident in the kitchen. He was charged. He was processed. He was released on bond. He was required to attend mandatory counseling as a condition of that bond. The criminal proceedings and the divorce proceedings ran in parallel over the following months, in the way that these situations tend to run when the documentation is thorough and the legal representation is competent, and the person who is harmed has been preparing for exactly this for 6 months. The custody proceedings produced an outcome that everyone involved has described as appropriate given the evidence. Renee was granted primary physical custody of Amara. Marcus was granted supervised visitation, which meant that his contact with Amara would occur in the presence of a court-appointed supervisor until such time as the court was satisfied that unsupervised contact was appropriate. Renee has said that the supervised visitation arrangement was the outcome she had been working toward from the beginning of her 6 months of preparation. Not because she wanted to eliminate Marcus from Amara's life, but because she understood that Amara's relationship with her father needed to be rebuilt on a foundation of demonstrated safety rather than assumed safety, and that the court's supervised structure was the appropriate framework for that rebuilding to happen in. Amara has been in therapy since the Thursday kitchen evening, with a child therapist who specializes in the particular kind of work that 7-year-olds need after witnessing something in their home that contradicts the fundamental assumptions they had built their understanding of the world around. The therapist has said, in general terms and without specifics, that Amara is resilient and that the stability of Renee's response to the situation, both in the immediate moment and in the months that followed, has been the single most significant factor in Amara's recovery. According to data published by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, approximately 1 in 4 women in the United States experiences severe intimate partner violence at some point in their lives, and children who are exposed to violence in their homes are significantly more likely to experience a range of adverse outcomes in their development and their own future relationships. The research also shows that women who are planning to leave abusive situations and who are able to do so with legal, financial, and social support in place before they leave are significantly more likely to successfully establish safe and stable post-separation lives for themselves and their children than women who leave in crisis without that preparation. Renee's story is, among many other things, a story about preparation, about the specific kind of preparation that a woman makes when she has understood her situation clearly and has decided to address it strategically rather than reactively. She had 6 months. She used them completely. And the Thursday evening that arrived before she was entirely ready found her ready enough, because the preparation she had done meant that when the moment came, she knew exactly what to do in the next 90 minutes, and the 90 minutes she spent on her phone that evening did more to secure her daughter's future than any confrontation or any emotional response could have done. Marcus has not made extensive public statements about what happened. He has said that he made choices he cannot take back and that he understands the consequences of those choices are appropriate. He has said he is in counseling. He has said he loves his daughter. He has not said much beyond this publicly, and his attorney has advised him, appropriately given the ongoing proceedings, to say as little as possible in public forums. What he has said in the supervised visitation sessions with Amara, according to the court-appointed supervisor who has been present for those sessions, is that he is sorry and that he is working on understanding what being sorry actually requires of him, which is a more honest account of where he is than most people in his position manage to produce. Whether it is enough is a question that belongs to Amara and to the future rather than to anyone's present assessment. Children are not obligated to forgive on anyone's timeline. Amara is 7 years old. She has Gerald. She has a mother. She has her grandmother and her chapter books and her soccer team. She has time. Renee has said, in the one extended public account she has given of this period of her life, that the 6 months of preparation were not the result of planning a specific outcome. She said she had not known exactly what the outcome was going to be or when it was going to arrive. What she had known was that she needed to be ready for whatever arrived, because she had a daughter who was watching everything she did and who was going to learn for what she did how to handle the moments when the people who were supposed to protect you failed to do so. She said she wanted Amara to learn that the right response to that failure was not to collapse or to perform helplessness or to wait for someone else to fix it. She wanted Amara to learn that the right response was to know your options, prepare your resources, stay composed in the moment, and act precisely when the moment required action. She said she had tried to teach this by doing it. She said she hoped it had been received. Her therapist, who has been working with Amara since the Thursday kitchen evening, has told Renee that in their sessions, Amara consistently describes her mother as the bravest person she has ever seen. Not because Renee stepped in front of the kettle, though Amara mentions that. Because of what Renee did in the 90 minutes after, when she was hurt and scared and her daughter needed her to be clear, and she was clear. That is the thing Amara talks about most. Her mother was clear. So here's what I want to ask you before we close today. Because this story asks something of every person who hears it, and it is not a comfortable question, but it is an important one. If you have been in a situation where you understood what was happening around you before the people around you understood it, and you had the opportunity to prepare yourself before the moment of crisis arrived, did you use it? And if you did not, what stopped you? And if you did, what made it possible? Because Renee's story is ultimately a story about the gap between knowing and doing, and about what happens when a person closes that gap with the specific tools available to them before the moment requires those tools. She had 6 months. She used all of them. And on Thursday evening, when the moment arrived, before she was entirely ready, she was ready enough. That is not luck. That is preparation. And preparation, as Renee would tell you, is what love looks like when love has to be practical. Tell me in the comments what you think. I read every single one. And if you or someone you know is in a situation that requires support, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is available at 800-799-7233, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and all calls are confidential. Subscribe to Behind the Lie and turn on that notification bell. Because next time on this channel, we're going into the story of a woman who smiled and said nothing for 17 years while her husband's family called her worthless at every dinner table and every holiday gathering they ever shared. What none of them knew was that she had been worth more than all of them combined since the second year of her marriage. And the morning they finally found out was the morning everything changed. We will see you there.